it is time for this beast. Now, I'm going to address this side of the board first. Notice it says 50 trades on the board. 50. So, I'm going to have people talking about the trades that aren't on the board. I have 50 on the board. So, let's get into it. The Toronto Maple Leafs. The most followed, loved, and probably the most hated at the same time. So, the Toronto Maple Leafs are a team that divides loyalties all over. They've been in playoffs in 68 out of their 101 seasons. They've had Stanley Cups in 1918 as the Arenas, 1922 as the St. Patrick's, 1932, 1942, 1945, 1947, 48, 49, 1951, so really nice run there, 1962, 63, and 64, and, of course, 1967. Since 1967, it's been a mixed bag for Toronto. They haven't been back to the finals since then. They were the Toronto Arenas from 1917 through 1919. They should have been called the No Livingstons. They were the Toronto Blue Shirts in the NHA. The National Hockey Association called itself the National Hockey League to get rid of Toronto owner James Livingston. And all the Toronto players went to the arenas, just not the owner, because they wanted him out. And the NHL went to comical lengths to make sure he stayed out of the NHL. There's a whole video on James Livingstone on the channel. St. Patrick's from 1919 to 1926. And then they came up with Maple Leafs in 1926 to go forward from there. And, of course, the Maple Leaf became Canada's flag after that. Or as my grandfather used to call it, Pearson's pennant. Didn't respect the flag. My grandfather was not a fan. Anyways, all-time leaders. So we get into the all-time leaders, and your points leader is Matt Sundin. 420 goals, 567 assists, 987 points. Now, I enjoyed having him in Vancouver, but honestly, he should have got 1,000 points in Toronto, and probably should have stayed in Toronto. Daryl Sittler, 389 goals, 527 points, 916 points, and he should have had 1,000 points in Toronto, but he feuded pretty openly with Harold Ballard, and you don't do that and stick around, so Ballard shipped out Sittler as soon as he could. When he had a feud with Sittler, and Sittler's like, I got a no trade, you can't touch me, he instead traded Lanny McDonald, who was best friends with Daryl Sittler, but we'll get into those trades later. Davey Keon, 365 goals, 493 assists, 858 points, and of course, he had an open feud with the Toronto Maple Leafs on his way out the door as well, one which was only remedied very, very recently. So Davey Keon, good relationship with the Toronto Maple Leafs right now, but for decades that wasn't the case. Boreas Salming, 148 goals, 620 assists for 768 points. I am not aware of a feud that Boreas Salming had with Toronto before he went to Detroit, but I wouldn't be surprised. George Armstrong, 296 goals, 417 assists, 713 points. Ron Ellis, 332 goals, 308 assists, 640 points. Frank Mahovlich, 296 goals, 301 assists, 597 points. 597 points. Enunciate, Shannon. Bob Pulford, 251 goals, 312 assists, 563 points. Ted Kennedy, 230 goals, 330 assists, 560 points. Rick Vive, 299 goals. You couldn't keep him around for one more goal? 238 assists, 537 points for Rick Vive, who was the first 50-goal scorer that the Toronto Maple Leafs had ever had. And he did it with a team that wasn't very good. Your wins leaders, Turk Broda, 304. Johnny Bauer, 219. Felix Potvin, 160. Curtis Joseph, 138. And Mike Palmateer with 129. Palmateer played behind some teams that weren't very good in the 70s and 80s. Coaching wins, Punch Imlock, 370. Pat Quinn, 300. Hap Day, 259. Dick Irvin with 216. And Mike Babcock is on the board, 164 wins. So I would say the odds of Babcock ending up number 2 on this board, pretty good. The odds of him ending up number 1, we'll see. I think he can go another few years without a Stanley Cup, but eventually Leafs fans will be like, okay, that's enough. And management will say, all right, we're done. We're being patient because it has been 52 years. So patience starts to become more and more fleeting as time goes by. Their history of captains, not bad for an original 16. 1925 through 1937, Hap Day is their captain. 1926-27, Bert Corbo, I should say, was also captain. 1937 to 38, Charlie Conacher. 1938 to 40, it's Red Horner. 1940 to 43 and 45 to 48, it's Sil Apps. 1943 to 45, Bob Davidson. 1948 to 55 and 55 or 56, 60, 57. 56, 57. I'll get it. Ted Kennedy. Sid Smith, 1955-56. Jimmy Thompson, 1956-57. George Armstrong, 1958 through 1969. Davy Keon, 1969 through 75. Daryl Sittler, 75 through 79. Then they took the captaincy away from him and gave it back to him a year later. 80 through 82. Rick Vive, 1982 through 86. Rob Ramage, 1989 to 1991. Wendell Clark, 1991 to 1994. He does not have an E at the end of Clark. 1994 to, I caught it. 1994 to 97, Doug Gilmour. 1997 to 2008, Matt Sundin. 2010 through 2016, Dion Phaneuf. They have not had a captain since Phaneuf left. And all indications are Matthews Tavares. It's likely a choice between the two. Top 10 draft picks. This is a bit of a list, isn't it? So with a lot of these videos, it might be Egyptian hieroglyphics on this side of the board. In this case, it may be very difficult. If you're on a phone, you can't read this. That's why I read it out to you guys. So their top 10 draft picks. 1963 drafting 6th, they get Walt McKechnie. 1964 drafting 5th, Tom Martin. 1966 drafting 4th, they get John Wright. 1968 drafting 10th, Brad Selwood. 1969 drafting 9th, Ernie Mosier. 1970 drafting 8th, Daryl Sittler. Good pick, that one. 1973 they draft 4th, they get Lanny McDonald. Drafting 10th, Bob Neely. 1975 drafting 6th, they get Don Ashby. 1979 drafting 9th, one of my favorites, Laurie Boschman. Don't think I've done a video or put him in my Hall of Fame yet, but that should happen. Honestly, it should. I love Laurie Boschman. He could score and he could fight. 1981 drafting 6th overall, they get Jim Benning. 1982 drafting 3rd, Gary Nyland. 1983 drafting 7th, Russ Courtnall. 1984 drafting 4th, they get the Wild Thing, Al Iafrate. 1985 drafting 1st, Wendell Clark. And the first thing that they were told about Wendell Clark is leave him at defense. He's a defenseman. And Toronto goes, we're going to make him a forward. Which point we're like, no. He's a defenseman. Leave him a defenseman. And Toronto's like, we think he's better at forward. At which point people just stopped trying to advise them. They were right. Clark was excellent at forward. 1986 drafting 6th, Vinny Domfus. 1987 drafting 7th, Luke Richardson. 1988 drafting 6th, Scott Pearson. 1989 drafting 3rd, Scott Thornton. 1990 drafting 3rd, Drake Barahowski. A lot of guys here that you look at and you go, oh, really? That was the top 10 draft pick? 1992, no exception. At 8 is Brandon Convery. I always thought Convery was going to make it, and then he just didn't. I believed in him. I remember when Vancouver got him, I was like, good. And they got him for Lonnie Bahanas. No, that trade's not on the board. 1998, I should say, drafting 10th, Nick Antropov. 2008, drafting 5th, Luke Shen. 2009, drafting 7th, Nazem Kadri. 2012, drafting 5th, Morgan Riley. 2014, drafting 8th, William Nylander. 2015, drafting 4th, Mitch Marner. And, of course, famously in 2016, drafting 1st, Austin Matthews, who someday will rule this overall chart. And he'll be the first Maple Leaf to score 1,000 points in a Toronto jersey. Prove me right, Austin Matthews. Now over to the trades. And, like I said, there are a lot of them. There are 50 on the board. So let's go ahead and get into it. March 3rd, 1968. So I didn't go further back than 1967. This is the rule I have even with the original 6. Because otherwise, it's insane. It's insane. So there were a lot of trades like in the 1920s these guys made. I'm not reporting on the trades from the 1920s. March 3rd, 1968, Toronto gets Norm Allman, Floyd Smith, Paul Henderson, and Doug Barry. Detroit gets Gary Unger, Pete Stemkowski, Frank Mahovlich, and Carl Brewer. Frank Mahovlich being traded by Toronto was seen as a mistake. And it was seen as a mistake because he was a very popular figure in Toronto. And, ownership at the time, I don't know, we'll get into that. January 31st, 1971, Toronto gets Bernie Parent and a 1971 second-round pick, which became Rick Kehoe. Philadelphia gets Bruce Gamble, Mike Walton, and a 1971 first-round draft pick. So pretty solid trade right there. March 3rd, 1973, Toronto gets a 1973 first, which became Ian Turnbull, and Eddie Johnston. Boston gets Jacques Plante and a 1973 first. Plante at that point is done. So, smart move there by Toronto. Isn't that weird? I keep saying that. May 15th, 1973, Toronto gets a 1973 first, which became Bob Neely, Doug Favell, and Willie Brossart. Philadelphia gets a 1973 second, and Bernie Parent goes back to Philly. So, Favell had some upside at the time. So, there was that. September 13th, 1974, Toronto gets Blaine Stoughton and a 1977 first. Pittsburgh gets Rick Kehoe. Stoughton was great, but Stoughton's best years were played out of a Toronto jersey, not in it. And for Rick Kehoe, he's one of the all-time greats for Pittsburgh. Before Mario gets there, he was the greatest that played for Pittsburgh. June 13th, 1978, Toronto gets Dave Burrows and a 1978 sixth-round pick. Pittsburgh gets Randy Carlyle and George Ferguson. Huge win for Pittsburgh there, Randy Carlyle. Big star player in Pittsburgh. Mistake by Toronto. Lack of patience. So they traded Kehoe and Carlyle to Pittsburgh. December 29th, 1979, Toronto gets Pat Hickey and Wolf Paymont. Colorado gets Lanny McDonald and Joel Quenneville. This was a move made out of petty dislike by ownership and management. And so Lanny McDonald is traded to the worst organization in the league in the Colorado Rockies. And that's the kind of move that you get from the Toronto Maple Leafs at this time. There would be hockey trades made where they're trying to improve the team. But a lot of the time you'd look and go, that looks like it was probably personal. February 18th, 1980, Toronto gets Bill Derlego and Rick Vive. Vancouver gets Jerry Butler and Dave Tiger Williams. I love Tiger. Great player, but that's a huge win for Toronto. Derlego was a solid player down the middle. And for Vive, of course, he was the first Maple Leaf to score 50 goals in the season. And Vancouver hadn't had anybody who'd scored 50 goals in the season at that point either. March 10th, 1981, Toronto gets Michel Bunny Larocque. Montreal gets Robert Picard. Now, Larocque gets traded because he had a personal beef with Montreal, and because Montreal wants to stick it to him, they send him to Toronto, which is not a great team at the time. And it's one of those petty things Montreal was doing at the time. So it's not just Toronto that was making petty moves. January 20th, 1982, Toronto gets Rich Costello, a 1982 second, which became Peter Inachak, and Ken Strong. Philadelphia gets Daryl Sittler. Now, on the surface, Philadelphia wins this trade, but Daryl Sittler is wearing down. He's towards the end of his career. That being said, that's not exactly why he was traded. He was traded in part because management didn't think that he was a solid captain for them. They needed to improve things. So they traded Daryl Sittler. And what they got back looked a little bit less than what they should have. It looked like they settled for less. March 8th, 1982, Phil Drouillard and Walt Podobny are acquired. Edmonton gets Laurie Boschman. I liked Walt Podobny. Walt Podobny's one of those guys that if not for injury, if he'd been able to play a full career and not gone through the injury stuff he did, honestly, he was a pretty good player offensively. Defensively, but offensively, he was pretty good. That being said, trading out Laurie Boschman, I'm not sure. To this day, I don't know. Like I said, at some point I'll do a Laurie Boschman video because I like Laurie Boschman. December 2nd, 1986, Toronto gets Rick Lands from Vancouver. Vancouver gets Jim Benning and Dan Hodgson. Benning had a couple of really good years after that deal, but I could understand why Toronto was after Lands. Rick Lands was also a solid defenseman I can at some point do a video on. It's easy to forget him because Rick Lands and Doug Hallward were two guys who were on a pretty bad Vancouver blue line, but they were two of the bright spots on a pretty bad Vancouver blue line. And so Lands being acquired by Toronto, I understand what they were going for there. September 3rd, 1987, Toronto gets Eddie Olczyk and Al Secord. Chicago gets Bob McGill, Steve Thomas, and Rick Vive. So, again, in this case, I kind of get it. Kind of, sort of. But it's a shame that Vive gets traded. And they did miss Thomas. Thomas would end up going back to Toronto. I'm pretty sure he played for Toronto twice. But Secord, former 50-goal scorer, there's some upside there. And Eddie Olczyk, good young player. November 7th, 1988, all of us scratch our heads as Toronto gets John Kordic and a 1989 sixth, and Montreal gets Russ Courtnall. Everybody was scratching their head on this one. Probably even John Kordic, to be honest. Because, yes, they needed some toughness, but Russ Courtnall was Russ Courtnall. And you would think that if they'd been out on the open market saying, hey, we're looking at trading Russ, they would have got more back. But that's not really how Toronto seemed to be doing things at the time. June 16th, 1989, Toronto gets Rob Ramage. Calgary gets a 1989 second, which became Kent Manderville. Good move by Toronto, this one. Rob Ramage becomes their team captain for a couple of seasons. October 16th, 1989, Toronto adds a defenseman and Tom Curvers. Offensive defenseman, not good defensively, but very good offensively. They give up a first-round pick in 1991. This is why you don't trade future draft picks like that. Scott Niedermayer became that number one. And yes, there's a danger that the Vancouver Canucks could have given up a big name in 2021 or 2020 to get JT Miller. I know. In that video, or when I do the Vancouver Canucks video, I will have that trade on the board as well. But this is the danger of trading first-rounders that are years out. And so Scott Niedermayer goes to New Jersey. I think Toronto would have liked Scott Niedermayer a lot. November 10th, 1990, Toronto gets Dave Ellett and Paul Fenton. Winnipeg gets Ed Olczyk and Mark Osborne. So Olczyk was not a member of the Toronto Maple Leafs for an extremely long time. December 17th, 1990, Toronto gets Mike Foligno and a 1991 8th-round pick. Buffalo gets Brian Curran and Lou Francischetti. So I will qualify that as a win for Toronto because Mike Foligno was a lot of fun to watch with the Leafs. And I understood what Buffalo was doing there as well. January 16th, 1991, Toronto, Bob Rouse and Peter Zezel are acquired from the Capitals for Al Iafrate. Iafrate was a lot of fun as well during an era where players seemed to have a little more personality publicly than they do now. Iafrate, though, the way he played hockey, he tended to get hurt a lot. So there was that tendency and there was that drawback to his game that he did get hurt. That being said, Toronto, Rouse and Zezel, not bad. September 19th, 1991, Toronto gets Glenn Anderson, Craig Berube, and Grant Fuhr. So that's two members of the Edmonton Oilers dynasty. And again, this is a Toronto team that wants to build itself up. This is 23 years out from that 1967 Cup, so they want to win something. Give its fans something to look at and hope for. But Edmonton gets Vincent Domfus, Peter Ing, Luke Richardson, Scott Thornton, and Cash. It's a lot of names. Honestly, the only one that really kind of hurt was Vincent Domfus. Outside of that, it was a gamble that seemed to pay off for a while there. January 2nd, 1992, Toronto gets Doug Gilmour, Jamie McCowan, Kent Manderville, Rick Natras, and Rick Walmsley. Calgary gets Craig Berube, Alex Godinnik, Gary Lehman, Michel Petit, and Jeff Reese. It's always a bad trade no matter how I try to spin it. I'm not going to try. But Flames fans said, well, hey, Lehman had 50 goals once. Didn't really matter. This was just an awful trade. A lot of names, a lot of guys involved, but terrible trade from Calgary's point of view. June 20th, 1992, Toronto gets a 1992 first, which became Brandon Convery, a second first-round pick as well, a 1992 fourth. The Islanders get a 1992 first. Darius Kasparaitis was that first-round pick, and involved in this three-way deal as well. 1992 second went to Washington, which they used to draft Jim Carey, a third and a fourth. So nice three-way trade there. Darius Kasparaitis is the biggest player, and that was the one that went to the New York Islanders. February 2nd, 1993, Toronto gets Dave Andrechuk, Darren Pupa, and a 1993 first, which became Janssen. Buffalo gets Grant Fuhr and a 1995 fifth-round pick. Buffalo loses this trade a lot, by a wide margin. Fuhr would absolutely bomb out and end up going to LA. And, Toronto wins that deal. No problem saying that. Although Pupa would not last very long as a member of the Maple Leafs. March 21st, 1994, Toronto gets Mike Gartner. The Rangers get Glenn Anderson, a 1994 fourth, and Scott Malone. So this was the New York Rangers loading up for the Stanley Cup in 94, and sadly Mike Gartner getting shipped out at the same time. So this is a team that's built for the Stanley Cup, and sorry Mike, we know you've been in the league about 15 years and you want a Stanley Cup, but sorry, we got to get Glenn. And that's kind of how that worked out. June 28th, 1994, Toronto gets Garth Butcher, Matt Sundin, Todd Warner, and a 1994 first. Quebec gets Wendell Clark, Sylvain Lefebvre, Landon Wilson, and a 1994 first. Sundin makes this a huge win for Toronto. Not even close. Not even close. It's a huge win for Toronto on that one. April 7th, 1995, Toronto gets Ty Domi. Winnipeg gets Mike Eastwood and a 1995 third-round pick, which became Brad Isbister. It gave Toronto the grit they needed. It gave them the identity they needed up front. It was a smart move. Even though they gave up the skill to get it, I thought it was a smart move. July 8th, 1995, Toronto gets Larry Murphy. Pittsburgh gets Dmitry Mironov in a 1996 second. Larry Murphy, excellent defenseman, had a bit of a bumpy ride in Toronto, but he had some good times there as well. March 13th, 1996, Toronto, Wendell Clark, Matthew Schneider, and DJ Smith. Going the other way, the Islanders get Sean Haggerty, Darby Hendrickson, Kenny Johnson, and a 1997 first, which became Roberto Luongo. So you don't want to say that they lose a trade getting Wendell Clark back, but they lost a trade getting Wendell Clark back. Luongo, of course, went on to a pretty decent career, so that's Luongo and Niedermeyer. So, really, this was just a matter of, this is where the Leafs ran into trouble was giving up futures, believing, okay, we just need to patch this together. It's not the same thing they're doing now. What they've done now is they've got a good young core, and they're trying to supplement it as they need to in order to make it a winner. What was happening back then was just a lot of veteran players. And so they would try to bring in other veterans and try to, keep this going. And before the salary cap era, money was no object. So they would just go out and get as many high-priced talents as possible and try to make it work. Moving along, February 25th, 1997, Toronto gets Jason Smith, Steve Sullivan, Alan McCauley. New Jersey gets Dave Ellett, Doug Gilmour, and a 1999 fourth. The unusual thing with the Doug Gilmour era is it just feels short. It's 5 years. It feels short. Considering just how much Gilmour turned that team around. It just seemed weird that he got traded. And that he didn't spend the rest of his career in Toronto. March 18th, 1997, Toronto gets future considerations for Larry Murphy from Detroit. And then he would hold up a Stanley Cup with Detroit. So that was a big loss for Toronto. And that was one they took on the chin. That was bad, where it was really publicly obvious that Murphy needed to go. Fans said he was done. He goes to Detroit, and surprise, surprise, Stanley Cup. March 24th, 1998, Toronto gets a 1998 fourth-round pick, which became Ponikarovsky. Detroit gets Jamie McCowan. So again, they set Detroit up for back-to-back Stanley Cups, but Ponikarovsky had a decent career as well. February 9th, 2000, Toronto gets Darcy Tucker, a 2004 and a 2001 fifth, which became Kyle Wellwood. Tampa Bay gets Mike Johnson, Marek Posmick, a 2005 sixth, and a 2001 fifth. So Toronto wins that deal. They had Darcy Tucker and Shane Corson for a while as members of the Leafs, and it made them very much disliked. It definitely added that sandpaper. March 5th, 2003, Toronto gets Owen Nolan, San Jose gets Brad Boyes, Alan McCauley in a 2003 first. Honestly, they were going for it. Owen Nolan, I always liked Nolan. I'm not going to give him a loss for getting Owen Nolan. March 3rd, 2004, Toronto gets Brian Leetch, which seemed to be sacrilegious at the time that Brian Leetch would leave the Rangers. 2004 fourth round pick, the Rangers get Jarkko Immonen, Maxim Kondrachev, a 2004 first, and a 2005 second. So I'll give that win to the Leafs, but again, I still hate the fact that the Rangers traded Leetch. That never sat well with me. June 24th, 2006, Toronto gets Andrew Raycroft. Boston gets the rights to Tuukka Rask. So again, this was alright, so we know Rask is going to be a good goalie, but we want to win now. Raycroft won the Calder Trophy. He's still young. We'll bring him in. It'll be fine. And it wasn't. Just mismanagement and just a lack of foresight. Just a very short-term thinking. June 22nd, 2007, Toronto gets Mark Bell and Vesa Toskala. San Jose gets a 2007 second, a 2009 fourth, and a 2007 first that became Lars Eller. So you can look and say, well, Toskala was a flop in Toronto. I would counter with they didn't give up a whole lot to get him. None of those pieces really hurt them. Eller, of course, wasn't drafted by San Jose. They traded that draft pick to St. Louis afterwards. So I don't look at this as being a huge cost for Toronto overall. November 24th, 2008, Toronto gets Lee Stempniak. St. Louis gets Carlo Koliakovo and Alex Steen. The Steen part hurts. It does. He's still in the league. Stempniak didn't quite work out. September 5th, 2009, Toronto gets a 2010 second-round pick. Chicago gets a 2011 second-round pick, which became Brandon Saad, and third. So this is just a matter of Chicago's scouting being pretty solid, and they're usually able to pick guys out of second round through fifth and sixth. They can usually pick guys who can make the NHL, and Toronto was just taking a flyer on a pick that didn't work out. September 18th, 2009, Toronto gets Phil Kessel. Boston gets a 2010 first, which became Tyler Seguin, a second, and a 2011 first, which became Dougie Hamilton. And there was a lot of concern. It came out after there was some concern that as things kind of fell apart for Toronto, that Brian Burke was worried that could be Taylor Hall going to Boston and a big Seguin. So it's a big loss for Toronto there. And it again is a sign of a team that doesn't want to do a rebuild. It's a team that wants to just, okay, who's NHL ready? We'll throw that out there. We'll get as many NHL ready guys as possible. We'll make this work. January 31st, 2010, Toronto gets Jean-Sebastien Giguère. Anaheim gets Jason Blake and Vesa Toskala. Giguère was decent for Toronto, so I would say mild win there for them. January 31st, 2010, Toronto gets Keith Ollie, Dion Phaneuf, and Frederick Schuster. Calgary gets Nicholas Hagman, Mayers, Matt Stajan, and Ian White. So when you look at it overall, I would give Toronto the win for that. I know there's a lot of people who don't like Dion Phaneuf. I get it, and I know he took a lot of flack in Toronto, but he's the best player involved in this trade. February 9th, 2011, Toronto gets Jake Gardiner and Joffrey Lupul. Anaheim gets Francois Beauchemin. Huge win for Toronto on that one. Of course, Lupul's, had the LTIR problems and all that. And Gardiner still in flux right now, but Gardner's had a decent run with Toronto. And while Beauchemin is a good veteran talent, I would give that as a win for Toronto overall. June 24th, 2011, Toronto gets a 2011 first. Anaheim gets a 2011 first, which became Rickard Rakell, and a second, which became John Gibson. So Toronto trades up in the draft, and both draft picks that went to Anaheim became, I don't know that you qualify Rakell as a star, but he should be a 30-goal scorer again this year. And Gibson, an excellent young goaltender. So, but if they didn't trade that pick that became Gibson, do they have Freddie Anderson right now? Right? June 23rd, 2012, Toronto gets James Van Riemsdyk. Philadelphia gets Luke Schenn. That's a win for Toronto. June 19th, 2015, Toronto gets Zach Hyman. Florida gets Greg McKegg. A trade that nobody paid any attention to when it took place. Not really a big deal. It's fine. It's just, this Hyman kid, who knows? And now he gets a lot of minutes, and he's a pretty important player to them. July 1st, 2015, Toronto gets Kasperi Kapanen, Scott Harrington, Nick Spaling, a 2016 third and a 2016 first, which became Sam Steele, so that pick gets moved. Pittsburgh gets Phil Kessel, Tim Erickson, Tyler Biggs in a 2016 second, which answered the question, would anybody take Tyler Biggs in a trade? The answer was yes, Pittsburgh. This, of course, was to move on from Phil Kessel and to kind of embrace, okay, we're going to be bad. So we're going to be bad. We're going to do the rebuild. And, of course, they get Austin Matthews the following June, which would accelerate that rebuild into, hey, look, we're back in the playoffs. June 20th, 2016, Toronto gets Freddie Anderson. Anaheim gets 2016 first, which became Sam Steele, and a 2017 second. So I still say that trade is a win for Toronto. I know Steele may end up being an excellent player for Anaheim, but Freddie Anderson's an excellent goaltender. So overall a win for Toronto there, and it signaled that, okay, we had our down year, now we're going to get better. We're going to improve things. And first thing we're going to do is get a goaltender, so Lou Lamoriello worked his magic and picked up Freddie Anderson. January 28th, 2019, Toronto gets Jake Muzzin. LA gets Carl Grundstrom. Sean Dursey in a 2019 first. And it shows that while I've talked about Toronto building that young core and supplementing it, they are still a team, much like throughout the rest of their history, that's willing to deal their first-round pick. I didn't put the Patrick Marleau deal on the board, but that's another example of it, where they're willing to say, yep, first-round pick's gone. And, yeah, it's tricky when you're trading out that many first-rounders, because the odds will tell you that a first-round pick is more valuable than others for good reason. So we'll see how all this works out for them, but Jake Muzzin is an excellent defenseman and seemed to provide them with some extra stability. I know, they got knocked out in the first round again by Boston, but I think there's more stability on the blue line with Muzzin than there was before he got here. July 1st, 2019, so the last of 50 trades. Tyson Barrie, Alex Kerfoot, and a 2026 are acquired by Toronto for Nazem Kadri, Callie Rosen, and a 2023 going to the Colorado Avalanche. Gutsy move. If Kerfoot's really going to step into that number 3 center role, he doesn't have the grit of Kadri, but there's some offense there. And Tyson Barrie should provide them with something on the blue line that they didn't have this past year. They had some struggles on their power play that adding Barrie could help to alleviate. We don't know yet. The Leafs are one of those interesting teams that if somebody said to me, if they said, the Leafs are going to end their drought in the next 3 years, I wouldn't be surprised. If they were holding up the Stanley Cup and planning a parade next year, I wouldn't really be all that surprised either. And it's something that I never really felt during their runs when they had Belfour as their starting goalie or when they had Doug Gilmour leading the way. I never got the feeling that team was going to win a Stanley Cup. This team should. They have the stars. They have the ability. It's just a matter of putting it all together. And then finally ending all of the 1967 talk. But, they've had their ups and downs. And to me, it feels like they're going through one of their better periods. It just hasn't shown in the playoffs yet. It will. It just hasn't yet. Odds tell you that, yes, at some point they'll win some rounds. They'll get somewhere, and we'll see whether or not they're champs. So there you go. The history of the Toronto Maple Leafs. So from this point, I got Vancouver, Vegas, Washington, and Winnipeg, and then we're done. So there you go. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, for all your support. I'll talk to you again soon.